Okay, I think we'll make a start. Yeah, welcome back. Before we go anywhere, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Wurrung and Wurundjeri people, lands never ceded, and these proceedings take place in the spirit of reconciliation. I'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Just as a bit of a background, the Retrofit Lab will be sitting under the Melbourne City Centre for Cities, and the Retrofit Forum will be continuing through for the year. So it's been successful, and we aim to keep that going. We've got a great session today. Bring this pull up. We've got Andrew Cribb and Giorgio Marfella, helped out by Mark Lamb. So Andrew is a co-founder of Three Space in the UK, and of Redo, which works across the UK and Melbourne. Based in Melbourne at the moment, and gets involved in the wider view of retrofit and adaptive reuse. So looking at not just all the physical attributes and technical attributes, but the social and people side of things as well. So it'll be really good to get a little bit of the UK take on things as well, because they tend to be a bit further ahead than we are with policy, particularly around retrofit. And Giorgio is a senior lecturer in architecture here, amongst other very prestigious roles around registration and other things. And with Mark Lamb, an education fellow, they have some work on vertical extension, which I wasn't aware of. So I'm really keen to hear about, particularly as a structural engineer. I like that sort of thing. So it's the normal format. We'll have a sort of 15 odd minutes of presentation each, a healthy amount of questions time at the end, and we've got 5 or so minutes just to talk about what's new around the traps in retrofit. So with that, I might hand over to Andrew. If I stop sharing and you can start sharing.
Okay, I'm going to talk about retrofit as a quality of life and economic issue. I thought it'd be helpful to look at some context, and this context is for how we do things and how we think about cities. So new development, and I talked to developers in UK as well as here. They're facing a viability squeeze, so it's getting harder and harder with build costs where they are to keep doing what they want to do. So they're up against it, and development is stalling. Second one is there's a high office vacancy. Here in Melbourne, it's 18%. And whether it's COVID, work from home, AI, it's going through a bit of flux. Same thing with retail, except that's been going on for a lot longer. And in the UK, this is probably more for local government, is under enormous pressure to make their budget stack up, and as a result, they are selling off a lot of public assets. Third one is this pressure, understandably, for housing, and that, in our opinion, is often coming at the expense of sort of longer term thinking and planning. Inequality has been on the rise for a long time, but that's playing out in our world that we work in, loss of affordable space and loss of spaces for people to do things that we think make cities great. In terms of overlaying that with retrofit policies, in the UK, EPC is the big one in terms of operational carbon, and that is mandatory. And we're talking about commercial building here. To let a building, it has to be up to a certain standard, and that's going to increase, we think, to 2030. What we're seeing, how that plays out, and just a nod to Australia has one, but it's more voluntary. How we're seeing that play out is that investment decisions are the term of end of life of buildings come up more and more, and this adds fuel to that, if you like. And then also the retrofits that do go ahead are very much towards the A++ scenarios. So what that does is that takes a hit to the affordable stock that is out there. The other policy is planning side of things. In this case, if you followed it in the UK, is really interesting. On Oxford Street was Marks and Spencer building. And that went through all the way to the courts. Marks and Spencer wanted to knock it down, and M&S, the government pulled it in based on heritage to a small degree, but more so on that they hadn't justified why they couldn't use the existing building. And policy has gone and made a shift over time since that first began, making it quite tight now in, for example, in Westminster, policy around you must give that proof on why you can't use the existing building before you knock it down. But by far, the biggest shift that I noticed in the UK was public perception. And it became from why not just it's not listed so we can knock it down, to why are we knocking down any building, especially something like this that has a real place in Oxford Street and in London, and the media campaign and the whole profile that brought to it. I think that's a big difference that I don't see here as much, that same public opinion. So, in terms of an alternative, and that's what we're going to talk about today, if you think of quite simplistically traditional development being rather extractive, requires huge amounts of capital, it's quite speculative, and we're talking about office or commercial property here. To achieve grade A, high debt reliance, and then it's either a big win or it's a failure, which leads to stalled and buildings sitting there. Whereas what we're talking about is places that can adapt and evolve, retaining that affordable stock, low cost fit out, repurpose, retrofit, and viable through cross-subsidy models and high impact, high social value. A bit about us. Three Space has been operating for 15 years. We're a non-profit in the UK. We've repurposed banks, shops, schools, courthouses. Meanwhile use, so we're very, very quick and able to keep buildings going. Low cost of entry, so try to keep space as affordable as possible, and high impact. Our consultancy is in Melbourne, as well as London in the UK, and we do a lot of feasibility studies particularly to government on how they can use their assets without selling them off. This is an example for Three Space, and this one is with a private sector landlord. This is with Barclays Bank, and Barclays at any one time will have about 100 branches that they're closing. And this is on the high street at Oxford, and we converted it into a high street makerspace and co-working space. Very sort of quick, fast fit out. They've since turned that into a much more branded product called Eagle Labs and rolled it out across the UK. This is Southwark College in South London in Bermondsey, and that's a former school which was converted into London's first agritech incubator, and this was quite a number of years ago, and a lot of the startups that have come out of that are still going and doing really well in that space. The one I want to focus in on is International House in Brixton, and this is our biggest and most high-profile project to date. It's 12 stories, 6,500 square meters in Zone 2 in Brixton, right in the town centre, and owned by the council. We came on to deliver meanwhile use with the intention to introduce diverse uses and community value. It was deemed end of life when we took it on in 2018, and that gives you an idea of the type of stock it is, with an aging heating system and cooling system. Strip it back, and there's a beautiful waffle ceiling, which the architects in the room will probably appreciate. And the funding model that we have delivered is 5 floors of startups and scale-ups. So our largest company, there is a tech business that grew from 4 people to over 100 in a number of years. So quite high growth. And then we provide space for 5 floors of non-profits, creative use spaces and circular economy. And the picture on the left is the fabric floor working with Assemble, and that's fashion and textiles. That is subsidised. We have another floor that provides home for 70 local non-profits doing amazing different things, from refugee support to mental health to other community initiatives. About 70 of those, and they get the space free of charge. So that translate, we had a consultant look at this, and it's 15 times the social value of a typical office. On the top, just for good measure, it's got incredible views. We've got a sauna and restaurant. The interesting thing from the report that I mentioned is that when you start to put these types of use together and you allow for affordability and you allow for the cross subsidy, it delivers quite high impact. And you can see the job numbers there, 2,600 jobs over a relatively short time. But the connections and the tool on the left is a management consulting tool which shows how these diverse different groups have been connected and joined together through being located in a building at such scale. In terms of just some numbers on the operating model, and apologies, this is all in pounds, but just double it roughly to get the Aussie dollar. We're still paying rent to the council. It's the first living wage building in the UK, which means all the tenants have to pay their staff the living wage. And the thing I really want to focus on, I guess, is the £1 million that's been spent in improving and keeping the building going. So we're doing a cross-subsidy model where we're funding and supporting those groups that would otherwise be pushed out, supporting them, as well as creating an income stream which is done at scale, which can then be surplus and be spent back in the building. So we started with 100K and then continued this investment. And you can see there that quite a lot's gone into building services. But the other thing to point out is that tenants have also come along and invested their own money. They're getting the rent at lower cost, and they're incentivized to then put some of their own money in. So it's a different way of doing it rather than the traditional model, which is coming with quite a lot of capital upfront. And then you see the total that's gone in over 7 years of 1.2. It's probably a bit more now. So what if instead of being in meanwhile conditions, we thought about and we've modelled how it might apply if this was a longer term, if this was over 25 years and this was a decision that was made permanently. So this is a real building and a real test case and a real, a hypothetical modelling. Is a council-owned building, but equally you could apply this to the private sector. It is around the same size as the International House, a little bit bigger, about 7,000 square metres. It's in Vauxhall in London, in a more fringe of the commercial district. And the holding costs are quite high for the council. So option one is what the council did decide to do. So they needed to borrow 15 million. This was a report that was given to them by consultants and taken through as an agreed at committee that this is what they would do. So that's where this information has come from. So they borrow 15 million because they didn't have the money to do it. And that would provide them 55 pounds a square foot, which was the market rate for A-grade buildings at the time. They have to secure a pre-let, and it takes several years to go through the approval process and completion. Because what they need to do was increase the floor area slightly and then also do quite a deep retrofit to bring it up to that standard. Option two, and by the way, it's probably worth saying option one, the tenant that they had secured was WeWork, and WeWork went bust at the time, and it sat vacant for a very long time after that. So option one does come with all this risk of securing a single occupier. As option two, what we're saying is let immediately to a local operator invest a small amount of capital, 600K, fit out funded by the operator and the tenants, and then recycle that income back in the building. We did the calculation on rent and social value, and for rent, we said to the council we would offer a rent-free period to start with for 1 year, and then we'd offer a rent-free period in year 4. So in that year 4, we would invest these sums back into the building, 800K to $1 million, and there we would deliver an EPC compliant building. So we did the assessment on what would it be to put in a new chiller plant, some new LED lighting, and overhaul the systems, as well as some modernisation. And when we did the modelling against the comparison, if you look at the lower line, that's holding costs, and in the UK it's quite high in terms of taxes. If you have a building sitting empty, probably a bit higher here, but security costs are also quite high. And then if you look at option 1, which is the traditional one, which is what the council chose to do, that would be this big dip at the front where waiting for planning to come and waiting to do the construction, and then it would start to increase. And the rent, of course, is going to be higher, but then you'd face another dip after 10 years when their lease would end and you need to find a new tenant. So that's the assumption made. Whereas option 2, we're applying a steady increase with a little dip to allow for our investment back in the building in the 4th year. So it steadily increases, and we get this 8-year pinch point where they catch up and meet. And then the top option is where we're saying, okay, if you add in the multipliers in social value and the give back by providing homes for these organisations, you start to see massive increases. And I think this is where it works for a government rather than maybe say the private sector as much, where you start delivering huge amounts of sums in terms of social value on top of a modest rent or an income rent, and you've delivered the building improvements without the risk, for example, without losing your tenant where you work, which is highly speculative in the traditional approach. So to summarise, where the market stalls, and I think that's where we're at in the way I look at RNC and the people I talk to from the development industry, with build costs being quite high. And at the same time, there's groups that we work with who are really keen to take on space. And then if custodianship can build this long-term value, cross-subsidy is a way to support precincts and places and bring in these tenants that make places great. Don't have to choose, I don't think, between embodied operational carbon, economic value, and quality of life. I think they can all be done as one. And working at scale is really important. I think rather than small activations or small uses of these buildings, we need to find ways to deliver at scale.
All right, that's great. Thank you. We might hold off questions until after Giorgio and Mark have presented, just because we might be answering each other's questions, or might spark other questions as well. But I've definitely got some questions down there I'd like to ask. That was a great last slide. I particularly like the fact that it's not an either or. It can be economically advantageous, program, socially, everything, you know. And risk seems to be a huge thing, which we might talk about a bit later as well. Giorgio,
thank you, Brendan. And picking up on Andrew's ending at scale, so we thought I'm going to talk about potential for regeneration of very large scale buildings. This is some work that stems out of my now long-standing research in tall buildings in Melbourne, which I wrote a doctorate, and most recently with Dr. Marfella, who's here with me. We have revamped a bit this idea of what could happen potentially to a building stock of office towers in particular that this city has inherited. But before we jump into that, let's go to our cousins in New South Wales, in Sydney. So I'd like to start with Sydney, because whilst I'll be talking about Melbourne for much of this very short presentation, I would like to point out that this is probably arguably a global issue, in the sense that there is inherently many cities in the world that have inherited a significant amount of towers built in the second half of the 20th century. And these can range from different typology, different kinds of commissions that initiated them, different time periods as well. But broadly speaking, they are office buildings. Okay, if you look at high-rise production more recently, you'll find there's much more residential, arguably, but the stock is inherently commercial. So Sydney, here's 3 stories, 3 buildings. State office block used to be the government offices built in modern times. The middle building is the Water, Sewerage and Drainage Board building, a very good example of good environmental responsive architecture, if you can call it that way. For those days, it's a sunshade building responding to the environment in Sydney. At least in Australia, was celebrated as a good modernist example. And then on the right, far right there, the MLC Centre is Amber Harris, a landmark in Sydney. Now, what happened to these 3 buildings? The first one, the state government offices, was demolished in the early 2000s and made way to Aurora Place, a very large development designed by Renzo Piano. The middle building, despite its accolades locally, was partially demolished in the sense that the structure was stripped down from its composite condition to a steel skeleton. And then on the right, you see an example of a renowned architect who instead somehow whose work has been preserved, right? So through rehabilitation of the concrete facade. So those are the typical scenarios you would encounter for these buildings: the replacement, the partial conversion, or the restoration in some cases, because we should not forget the fact, particularly in Australia, there's a significant amount of these buildings that actually have heritage status, so it's actually not unusual. So looking back at Melbourne, what will follow is a bit of numbers, a bit of charts, a bit of pictures to talk about primarily about 2 things. What are the opportunities, I suppose, in Melbourne to do a fourth thing, not necessarily the usual replacement or the usual conversion or even the restoration, but what if there's another way to look at the future use of these structures? We're talking about fairly large buildings and confined in not necessarily within the CBD of Melbourne, which I'm showing here, but what will follow will fish from cases that are simply located in the historical centre of the CBD. So the colonial settlement from Spencer's to Spring and Latrobe to Flinders. So arguably, there's more examples we could put here on the plate, but I think concentrate on this historical core of the city is significant. This is a very quick snapshot of the data set. What did we look at? Well, we put together about 32 buildings that still are existent. We looked at different things. We looked at the form of the buildings. We're architects, so we'd like to obviously investigate it. We also investigated how they built, of course, when they were built. We also looked at the energy rating scoring, which is quite low, and needless to say, certainly not at the top end of things. The quality, great, depending on what property council qualification may give it to, from a peer premium to level B primary, and other factors that are embedded in there, the efficiency, matters that are related, of course, to the commercial nature of the building. So how big are these buildings and when were they built? Well, now, when we use the word tall, for those, I've been asked occasionally, what is a tall building? Well, there is a council on tall buildings now changed their name to the Council on Vertical Urbanism, but the idea is that actually there is a definition of what is a tall building, and what a tall building is not necessarily something determined by heart as a hard measure, but it's something that evolves in time. So in a city like Melbourne, a building of 70 meters in the 50s would be considered tall, but over time this threshold has shifted over to the 200 meters. We could talk more in depth about the fact that also tall buildings respond to business cycles, so they come in waves, and these waves become also representative of particular historical periods. So without getting too much in the history of all this, we're highlighting there at least 4 4 stages of tallness in the city of Melbourne that we can recognize. The city of Melbourne, like many other cities in the world, has been governed with a very simple planning principle, which is development driven by a multiplication of the size of the land, also known as plot ratio or floor area ratio, FAR. So historically, in Melbourne, this has changed a bit, but generally speaking, it's settled around a plot ratio of 12. And this is the existing plot ratios that we can have in this family of buildings, about 30 buildings that we identified. As you can see, they vary, but primarily they rarely go over the 12 mark. As I said, we'll also looked at the shape. From an architectural commercial point of view, it's not just about how big the buildings are, how much area they have, and how tall they are, but also what is their configuration. Configuration means also flexibility. It means also structural efficiency. So again, very briefly, to analyze this data set of buildings, you will find a trend in Melbourne for which we moved on from the slab towers or rectangular towers of some sort that were primarily built from the 50s to the 60s and 70s, relatively short by today's standards, often with a side core. And then from there, you find that there's a moment from the 70s to the 80s, right until the early 90s, where a dominant model emerges in the city. What is this dominant model? Is the square plane tower. But maybe just to mention some example, for those who remember the old World Trade Center in New York, that kind of building, square with a square core, the ominous, and tragically famous Grenfell Tower in London is that typology. So it's a very simple shape, very efficient. There's a number of historical reasons for which this has happened, but we almost seem to have a very good family of these buildings that it's pervasive, and here they are. So just 20 of them to show what we're saying. So it's a square on square. Some variations apply, and built primarily from the 1960s onwards. How are these buildings made out of? So in other words, what materials are contributing to the architecture? And so historically, again, you can see a very long-term here trend where we're moving from a steel-dominated world, which is highlighted there in blue, into a world where progressively concrete has become the more dominant structural material. What I'm highlighting, of course, buildings have got many different materials, but here we're referring to the primary structural material, which, of course, in a multi-story building is very important. It's the skeleton of the building, to be clear, like in these pictures. So you see some examples here, 1950s through the 60s, often steel frames embedded in concrete later on, very often also clad with precast, not necessarily glass, despite some misconceptions about the glass boxes of modern times. Very often these buildings have concrete envelopes. And then through the 60s, so through the 70s in particular, we saw an emergence of concrete in Melbourne in particular. There's a very strong culture of building concrete, famously celebrated in the 1980s by some Italian contractors who built many of these towers by having an all-concrete approach to high-rise, which to us sounds normal today, but it was certainly not the case in the past. So the concrete skyscraper is a relatively recent phenomenon. So if we were to analyze specifically what happens in these buildings, well, there's different ways you can look at the composition in terms of materials, but in a high-rise building, you probably have to think of 3 fundamental components: the core, which is in the middle, and houses the services, the perimeter frame, and the floors. And so here's just 6 examples of this to show how there's a dominant all-concrete approach in Melbourne in particular, but not necessarily all the time. The core tends to be almost all the time concrete, but the floors and the perimeter frame may change over time. And so here is a radar chart, some putting together these different technological aspects into one picture. So where am I heading here? Well, this is the stock that we've inherited, right? So if you were to somehow say, okay, is there a typical building you could show us that somehow summarizes the skyscrapers in Melbourne built in this period? And how is that possibly representative of all this family of buildings built over 40 years? Now, I should give a disclaimer. There's probably not such a building that will be exactly like this, but very often you'll find they have multiple traits of this picture here. So they would be square, they would have a 40 by 40 floor plate, typically a core in the middle, which is about a bit less than 20 meters, an efficiency of 70 to 80%, efficiency meaning that the office available usable space compared to the space of the services. And they would have a plot ratio that rarely exceeds 1 in 12 for the reasons of history that we said before. The facade could be precast or curtain walls. Often they might be sitting on a podium, particularly if they were built in from the 70s onwards, which is a good thing for a number of reasons, also for wind. The available plot ratio, however, in these lands have changed because in the late 1990s, Melbourne abolished plot ratios up until the mid-2010s, where as a result of a rather loose approach to density in the city, the city of Melbourne and the state government felt it was important to reintroduce plot ratios. So now we have again plot ratios, but it's significantly higher than the ones we inherited from the past. So the benchmark is typically about 18 plus potential bonuses. So what we're showing here is the available area that these buildings, notwithstanding the fact that they're already there and they're very big, that could potentially be developed further. And so this chart probably explains better what we're trying to show. So there is a certain amount of area available that has been already taken historically. But in orange, we're showing the potential for additional development in those lands. These are primary blocks of lands in the middle of the city, yet occupied by very obtrusive structures. And I think an overall estimate of only this sample is about 1.2 million gross floor area potentially available across this set, of course. Arguably, there will be even more. So, some final thoughts. So, what is the fourth way that we are trying to highlight here as a possibility, not necessarily as a solution, but also as an opportunity to reflect on what could happen? Tall buildings are inherently self-destructive. So, they have a tendency to regenerate themselves by allowing other buildings bigger than they are to replace them. That's always been, it's an historical fact, whether we agree with it or not. And so what if instead of allowing that laissez-faire to create more destruction and regeneration, in that sense, we were to think of the opportunity of extending vertically? And of course, this can happen on a case-by-case basis, but here we're making a very clear argument that these things could be also looked holistically at the district level of an entire city, potentially. Now, what would this mean is that you would have, in theory, and potentially, again, for looking back at the canonic square plan tower, a potential for at least an additional third of area available, that if it's not going on top of the tower, most likely will go somewhere else, either by knocking down the existing structure or by expanding the bottom of the tower, which is already happening and still happening very often in the city. Now, this is not an easy fix. Tall buildings are difficult to build in any case, but certainly extending them, there might be some examples I could have shown as well, including here in Melbourne, on lower medium-rise structures. But the idea of large tall extension is probably unexplored. And now, obviously, what would that mean? Well, first of all, you have to reason about height limit controls. Melbourne has a threshold that is dictated by air flight from a secondary airport, the Essendon Airport, which fundamentally puts a cap at 350 meters. The existing depth, leasing depth is a technical term to describe the distance from the core to the edge of the building, can be an opportunity, but also can be a loss. In Melbourne, typically, this will range from 10 to 12 meters, which is good for commercial services, less so for residential, but it's not that far to be reduced potentially to the 8 and 9 depth that could be suitable for hospitality or residential. Obviously, the problem with this type of intervention is the potential loss of income when you're talking about a premium building in particular, disruption to existing tenants, because if the idea is to extend it, after all, you might want to have to consider how to maintain a certain income for the owners. Then there are technical challenges, the limitations of building services, the fact that cores are very intrusive and large, the mechanical floors that are located in some areas, and the structural capacity. And I'm looking at Brandon here, of course, so ultimately it has to somehow be considered from a point of view of adding weight. But not only that, these towers in Melbourne in particular will be subject to significant wind conditions that obviously will be impacted by any alteration. However, what are the opportunities? Well, imagine if you could somehow free up, whilst allowing the developments to continue without putting at risk what's already there. Well, imagine if you could truly allocate to public the foot of these buildings, and as a matter of fact, and not as an announcement of new developments that often happens. Obviously, we will be extending the life cycle of these buildings, some of which are more successful than others. We could potentially be looking at opportunity to improve mixed use by having a combination of new functions or new models of workspaces potentially. We could even consider elevated public space. I mean, we could talk about the anecdote of some places in Melbourne that have been built very high residential towers, but then they were so striking that people felt the need to go out there and at least have an observation deck. So these things could also be used to the public advantage. And of course, lightweight construction would be an obvious choice given the consideration that we mentioned before. The opportunity to increase the building envelopes as well. Building integrated photovoltaics are an ideal opportunity for towers that will gain more solar access and they have more area on the facade than they have on the roof solar power, for example. And then finally, why not looking at the opportunity to encourage some of the best sectors of the industry to provide R&D, new materials, in modular construction or in engineer system, engineer materials that could be somehow innovative and therefore provide more spread out benefits to the industry. So I'm saying this because to me it seems that it's very much of a potential but also a risk. And it's a risk because I want to conclude on this picture, you know, with the waffle slabs that get knocked down all the time, right? So the issue on what we are trying to raise is the fact that if we don't consider these things already, because this might not happen tomorrow, it might happen in the next 10 to 20 years. If we don't consider the fact that these building typologies are inherently destined to be probably replaced by something else, inevitably, unless there's a strong control at city level to prevent this to happen and to govern it so there are possibly also economic benefits for the owners. Most of these buildings are privately owned. So the reality is that unless some of those areas are curtailed, the outcome will be this, with the obvious loss of energy that has been already used in their making. And so with this, I'll leave it at this, and then perhaps we can have some questions and further debate. So thank you, everybody.
Fantastic, Giorgio. That's great. Gets my blood running as a structural engineer, thinking about all of that ambitious out there work to be done. Okay, we've not too far over time, which is great. So we've got about probably 10 or 15 minutes for questions, and I'll break at some stage just to go through what's happening around the traps in retrofit, and we can always reconvene later if people want to stay on for questions. Are there any questions from the floor for either Andrew or Giorgio or Mark? Yeah.
Andrew. Just in thinking about what the light touch set of changes that you'd make, how did you think about access, particularly with the tenant group that you had in mind for something like the International House? And then also, how did you think about the inevitable surprises once you started touching the building and opening things up?
By access, do you mean?
For people, so universal access.
Disabled access, or yeah. So that's not without its challenges, and I think there's probably a middle ground there, and we seek to do that as much as we can. I think with the International House, it's relatively easy because there's a working lift and a good lift that, and we've been able to do that and cover everything there. I think your second question was around how we dealt with ongoing challenges. Yeah. And I think with that, it was almost initially, we had all the consultant reports on the condition of the building, and a lot of it was, I guess, us getting better at understanding the system of what they needed to keep them going, but also keeping in mind how long we had the building for, so investing little but not investing a complete overhaul, which may not pay back within the time frame that we had. So again, it's probably it's a middle ground approach, but we've successfully kept it going, particularly the thing like the heating system, which is really old. If you've ever heard of Versatemp, it's a heating and cooling system, and that cooling system was actually on the roof, and it was completely destroyed in a storm. And so the windows actually opened. So we've opened windows, so that serves as cooling, and the heating system is just converted to heating only. And we managed to work around that with some guys who'd been working on it for 10 years prior to that and knew that system. And then we bought replacement parts for that heating system, which are available from buildings which are all eventually going to disappear, but kept it going, finding these replacement units.
I should add, if anybody online wants to ask a question, you can throw something into the chat, and so we'll pick it up and read it out.
So I have a question.
Mm.
I'm keen to know about.
Hit your green button. Yeah.
I'm keen to know about Giorgio, like you were talking about tall buildings. What about maybe somewhat like mid-rise buildings, and because the challenges may be different, but at the same time, does it have some opportunities that may be there other that you don't find in the tall buildings?
Yes, that has been already looked at probably more. In that sample we show, arguably some of those buildings will fall into the medium rise. The difference, however, from a significance of the impact on the city is that those mid-rise towers, they're often infill blocks. They might be on relatively small parcels of land. Well, yes, you could still extend it potentially, but they don't have the potential impact that you can have when you have a very large development that is 60 to 70,000 net lettable area in the middle of the city. It's premium. We're talking about entire prime blocks that were consolidated. So the scale of the impact on the city, if it's mismanaged or if it's demolished, the quantities are exponentially larger, say, a 20-story building. But to your point, yes, that can also happen. And in fact, there's some exhibit that was shown, like International House. That's already happening. What we're flagging is, what about the big ones? What's going to happen to those? Because those are buildings that they're already at the end of their end life. They're at least 30 plus years old. So eventually something's going to happen there.
The questions around the table?
Oh, okay. Andrew, I was just really curious about the Marks and Spencer. I know a little bit about it, but I don't know a lot. So did the regulation, like the problems that they encountered, was there regulations in place that, created the situation that occurred, or did the regulations that prevented the demolition of it happen after they put the application in, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, both. And it's quite a long, drawn-out process, but my understanding of 2021 was there was an opportunity under central government policy rather than local government policy, and the central government policy had an option, which I wouldn't say was very strong, but ability for them to step in, and local government decides planning applications. So this was called in under a regulation that had, I believe, the two issues. It was heritage, but it wasn't a heritage listed building, but it's opposite the road from Selfridges, which is listed, for example, and other buildings in that pocket of Oxford Street. So that was, and then they also, the policy was around whole of life carbon, and I think it may have been word it as something like must do something that is responds to climate change. And they felt they had enough grounds to call it in on that. Subsequently, over that was 2021 and now 2024, 25, and this year, Westminster, City of London and Camden have all put in more robust planning policies, which I think if it was done again now, you would need to, that's really need to provide evidence on why you can't use the existing building.
So it's created a precedent.
It's followed that, but still the public perception, I think, also drove central government to step in, and they felt for political reasons as well as that it was the right time to call that in and test that through the courts.
And what does central government mean in the UK? Was that like our state government? Or?
Yes, yeah, that's the best way. Yeah, there's two tiers of without getting there is regional government, but think of it as two tiers versus three tiers here. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I might just pop in with a question from online. This is from Claire Bowles from I2C and Dope Waste Buildings. So Claire's asking Andrew, how can we encourage more asset owners or governments to see the value in option B, i.e. regenerative retrofit and enhanced community and social value? What has worked best from your perspective?
Good question. I think it's trying to get it back really early in the stages of when that decision is being made and when a building becomes surplus. I think that's really when it needs to be put in the mindset of the decision maker, because often it's too far down the track when the asset sale is typically what happens. That's been already put into the finances. So I think it's really bringing it back as early as possible. I do think planning plays a big part in the UK, and planning has put affordable workspace and also more so in whole of life carbon assessments, put a policy. So that does bring everyone to the table around a regulatory requirement, if you like, and that brings a little bit of a mindset change. And then I think it's getting in the mind of decision makers as early as possible, and trying to get more of these cases tested and showing that it's actually a low risk option rather than development is quite high risk. It's just it's always given, in my opinion, a free pass. Whereas if a community approach or more of a social or an economic or an entrepreneurial approach is it's always why did you give them the building? So I hope that's helpful. Yeah.
I wanted to just extend that question a little bit further, which is one of the things that interests me is it's easy to do the carbon numbers and economic numbers and program numbers and everything else, but there's a whole lot of other risks and opportunities on a building that you don't necessarily see. So, floor to floor heights and hazmat and all of that sort of thing. So you mentioned you do a lot of feasibility studies. What's that process look like? What that process looks like in Melbourne, as far as I can tell, is a whole bunch of consultants all randomly looking at different things, and hopefully it all washes out. But I'm just wondering if there's a more scientific, standardized approach to that feasibility study or viability study.
Yeah, and I think it's a bit of a challenge. We are often the last we get called when something goes wrong, and I think the typical approach is government may get let's say £5 million from in funding to put towards, it's a town hall, it's a library that's closing, it's a school that's closing, these assets. How could they've secured some funding, and they will often go straight to an architect, get a this crazy design, and then it comes back to us on the feasibility side. So our approach is always to look at trying to make it viable and trying to deliver that social impact. So I don't know whether I've answered that in any way.
Yeah. Usually the wrong way around with different people looking at projects, in my experience. Although I'm on the engineering side, so I would think that, I guess. look, we might just quickly go through what's going on around retrofit. Can everybody see that? Yep, that's up there. We should. So, yeah, these are interesting things. So, RMIT have issued a report looking at Barclay Street public housing in Brunswick, showing that this 12-storey block could deliver better social, economic, and environmental outcomes. So, again, across the board, as retrofitted rather than building it anew. So we just keep seeing that message coming in again and again and again. Now we just need government, I think, to listen to it a bit more closely. Last year, led by Kate Shaw, we had this great Standing Together event on public housing, which was a bit of a processed event, trying to raise discussion and debate around how we are treating the public housing towers. It was brilliant. We had everything from lawyers through to activists and public housing people, homeless people, even talking about these buildings and what we should be doing around them. So out of that, there's now been a report produced where all of the different people who spoke put together a page or two, and there's some QR links there on the right-hand side, both to the Barclay Street report from RMIT and also that Standing Together report. So it's worth it while just opening it up and having a flick through. It's a pretty easy read. And that last bit is something just put off the Age and the ABC News, which is staggeringly, even in light of the public inquiry into the process around the housing towers, the government has actually announced that there's another tranche of 7 towers being demolished. Albert Park, Flemington, Kensington, North Melbourne, Prahran and St Kilda. So there doesn't seem to be many ears listening at the moment. And what's concerning about these ones is apparently there's a very high percentage of elderly people in these homes. So people who thought these were going to be their forever homes. And I think the statistic is once you displace someone from their home, even though you might give them right of return once they've redeveloped it, those people are generally out of that home for anywhere from 7 to 9 years on average. So 7 to 9 years is a long time in anybody's lives, and people move on. In the case of the aged, people probably pass on. So these are serious impacts in society, and something we need to be doing better on. But just talking to Andrew about some of the differences with the UK and what's going on in Melbourne. Hopefully industry is starting to consider retrofit at this front end of projects. So hopefully that will flow through to governments and other people who have more impact in what we're looking at. There we go. And this is one from Don't Waste Buildings, who are arranging the next building tour. So these are great tours, basically get together and go through an existing building and have a look at all of the pros and cons. And I think actually convene to a nearby pub afterwards just to talk about the building tour and compare stories on retrofit as well. So this is Wednesday, the 6th of May, and it's the Broody up in Brunswick. 20 spots available, so you might have to get in quick if you want to get a spot on that. And so we have a recording of this happening, which will be available on the website. Are the presentation is available for people to look at the QRs as well?
Which presentations? Our existing ones?
Yeah.
You can find them on the Retrofit Lab website. But I'll also email out everyone who's signed up to a recording of this particular forum.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And then next session, April the 28th. Hannah Louie and Giorgio Warren Meyer. So this should be a really good session. Hannah has just finished a book called Adapt, which looks fantastic. I've had a look through it. I've got a copy. We're doing Retrofit Forum Studios in the faculty, and all the students are looking at it as well. So there's really good examples of retrofit through that, and we'll hear about some of the lessons Hannah drew from putting all of that together. And Giorgio Warren Myers is probably more in real estate and property than than architecture. So she sits between MSD and the University of Melbourne and Jones Lang LaSalle, and she's got some fantastic work on value propositions of retrofit, a little bit similar to what you're saying, Andrew, probably with some numbers along it as well. So there'll be a really interesting session to log into. And look, that puts us right on time. I'm conscious that there's, I've got a couple of questions here that I wouldn't mind asking, which I will after the event anyway, but please feel free to leave if you're in the room or to log off if you're online. But we might continue talking for a minute or two as well if our esteemed speakers don't mind. But before we go, if we could just put our hands together for Andrew, Giorgio and Mark. Thank you. Okay, those of you who want to opt out, please opt out. Andrew, I just had a question in how the different markets work between the UK and Australia. The attitudes have changed in the UK, and the question is being asked now, which is great. What other policy infrastructure is there in the UK? And I'm not thinking about planning type policy. I'm more thinking about incentives that local boroughs or councils or government provide to facilitate that question being asked more, and in particular to try and scaffold the social impact. So, housing, I presume, is an issue in the UK like it is here as well. Are there things over there that you think we can learn from here?
Other than the policy, the EPC and what was the other one? The other planning, the planning policy around whole life carbon. There is also carbon offsets, which is an interesting one, which is if a developer, and I don't know actually whether this happens here or not, but you may argue offsets is bad or it's good depending on how you think about it. But the regional government in London has introduced where the developer who can't meet their carbon requirements under the whole of life, they can pay an offset. And that goes into a fund locally, and that's meant to be spent on things like retrofitting houses and social housing and spinning. So you can see there's a good solution there. It has hit lots of teething problems, is my understanding. It doesn't, and local authorities have got this quite considerable sums now, and they are sitting there with this and not being able to quite work how to spend it. But it is an interesting lever, I guess, and another one to sort of add into the mix. I think the other one from retrofit is where I think it could go is around sort of skills and upskilling of people into doing this sort of work, particularly on the residential side. And I think that's a really interesting one. That there's a whole. I'm sure you guys are all over this, but there's not the skills to do it, even if we could do it on every building. So how could you do that, and how could you take people who don't have jobs and put them into work with this, and how powerful that would be in a social context. So yeah. I
think that's a really good point, the skills point, because it's a bit of a parallel to things like passive house and that sort of thing. Like it's starting to take off passive house now, partly because there's more people who understand how to build and comply with passive house. And I know talking to different architects, in these forums, that everyone who does their own house, it's a learning process around retrofit and sustainability and all the rest of it. So it is very different in the way that you design, and the risk profile is totally different. So having those skills and having that documented and being out there is a good thing. And Giorgio, I just someone to get into these projects makes me miss structural engineering. But the few that I've worked on, a lot of them have been infilling of the site rather than extending vertically, because extending vertically comes with quite a few big challenges, but not that it doesn't get done. I remember that I used to work in Singapore for a while, and across the road from us was a building that sort of sat like that, and the whole building had been bridged by another building on top of it on 3 or 4 mega columns and lift shafts around the outside, and that was driven through rental, lease values of the existing building being so high, the developers had extra plot ratio, but they couldn't afford to evict the existing tenants and get them out of there, so they decided just to build around them and over the top of them. But it still surprises me that this model of a central core with a building around it is a predominant model, because most buildings I've worked on, the starting point is from the client anyway. It's been with like a side core, because it means that it's an open campus floor plate, particularly for design type buildings, but any office environment, last thing you want is a solid barrier between any two employees. You want people to be able to have line of sight and to talk to each other.
Yeah,
So-
well, you are right. I mean, if you go to Docklands or, for example, the model you described, it's predominant. Yet in Melbourne, for some reason, the tallest structures have that. That's a predominant model. It's obsolete. There's no, I mean, I don't, although I'm not sure there's a new building that's, I won't say who designed, because I won't say it's an obsolete building, it's a new building, but it's I think there might be a return of this sort of smaller footprint, because the campus office place, it's very deep space, right? So you have 20 meters, and it's not necessarily free because you've got columns inside, whereas these buildings have 12 meters of unobstructed space, no columns in the way, right? Which was driven, of course, by interior design and fit out. So they're flexible, and they're not too deep, which is why it's fascinating, because whilst from a commercial development they're old, if you think architecturally, their opportunities are quite interesting, because you don't have that detachment from the envelope that you would have in some large campus buildings. So they're actually quite intriguing in that sense. And also, as you know, because they are symmetrical, and with a center core, the structurally, provided the foundations well, but you probably have better opportunities to log them again.
That's right, yeah.
Which is why, with this idea, I mean, have we thought about this?
I'm just wondering if there's also a piece of work that looks at the retrofitability of buildings and the flexibility to change them that we can actually bring into new buildings. Because like you said, new building built on an obsolete model is not a great starting point for any developer, I would have thought. But if you had side core arrangements that sort of lent themselves also to future fit out as residential, or even maybe you have mixed use or something, something a bit more flexible that had mixed use and gave more options into the future. It'd be interesting to see what the value equation like that was to a developer.
Yeah, and obviously this group of buildings, use the center or center square plan sort of as an example, but there are some of the buildings you described in that lot. The other thing I'll also flag is the fact that the opportunity of using materials that are lighter. So it's engineered timber or steel become more appealing than in that context, rather than potentially building ex novo, including with those materials like the.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you office space is usually 4+1, 5 kPa live load, and residential is closer to 1.9. So there's 3 kPa per floor you're gaining.
Yeah.
So tall towers, you've got capacity to extend them vertically from gravity load. The issue comes from increased sail area under wind and increased earthquake forces, but there's ways and means of strengthening buildings for those as well. So.
In fact, engineering-wise, there are many questions I have, of course, but I can, with a bit of intuition, I can see the potential as well, because often these are concrete, as I said, structures, but also they are steel embedded in concrete for fire safety. So they might have already some inherent capacity that perhaps could be looked at.
Yeah. All right, are there any other questions around the room?
More of a regulatory one. I think council made some changes to the legislation around not knocking down buildings. But if you do, lose a lot of ground space and lose the pop rate, the benefit pop ratio. Came through last year, I believe. And then the other one is not Retrofit in Melbourne, but in Sydney, that 3XN tower, the real reason the way that got developed was to airspace rights. If they had knocked it outside again, it would have been a larger build as high, notwithstanding air traffic zones. And is that a thing here as well? Airspace rights.
Yes, yes. In fact, Essendon Airport puts a hard limit.
Overlay, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's more to do with the air traffic control. It's actually very complicated. So it's actually a secondary flight path of emergency that requires a certain turnaround, and that puts essentially 350 meters cap in. But some of the buildings we looked at, I don't think they will reach 350 meters because they're already 200. I mean, there's quite a bit of potential.
That's where operation, that's where Central Core plant, which was coming through the 80s or something. I vaguely remember from construction component lab to a degree that the real reason for that to create a terrible floor plan is construction efficiency. They sort of do that sort of slip, build the core, then a floor, then some more core, and then a floor. So it's actually the speed of construction that drove that whole design.
Absolutely.
No great design.
No, it's yeah. Well, it depends on the great design. They were great design to build because yes, absolutely. It was a particular recipe.
Most of my saw that as well, but still.
It couldn't be so much an advantage speed-wise, though, surely, because it's getting the core up first. I know that you need to be. One of the arguments against steel buildings is I'm trying to remember how it goes now, but the core can't get too far advanced from the floor plates or something like that, and that's the construction. It's more of a safety thing, I think.
Oh.
But in terms of building a side core or a central core, you know, it's one leg's behind the other, and I wouldn't have thought it was a huge difference between the two.
I mean, the question is historically. I mean, I've wrote a PhD on it, I suppose, so we could it's many, like every building phenomenon has many different reasons, right? So there's not one particular dominant reason why that was more prevalent or not, but somehow that particular topology ticked the boxes for the construction speed, the structural simplicity, also the fact that there was the need for a 12-meter deep. And this is prior to the campus landscape models that we have today. This is a time when you have insurance and bank companies with the executives, each one with their own room and the typist behind. So those kind of things all converge. And then there's the sense of the industries and we know it works and we're going to do it again. And so that repeated itself in the 80s.
I think that's a huge part of it.
And
is
that's part of it.
Low risk.
No risk, as we were saying, you don't want to take too many risks in development.
Yeah.
The result is what we are flying. I mean, it's important to understand why it happened, but those pictures are real. You can check. There's about 20 of those buildings in the CBD. And
one of the nicest offices I've ever worked in was Oracle House, which was the first official tall building in Melbourne. Is that right? But that's a side core. It's got short north shading to the windows, and it's got an 18-meter wide floor plate and just glass down each side of it, not full height glass, but spandrel panels and all that sort of thing. But you could turn the lights off in that building on the weekend and work comfortably at your desk because anything within about 9 meters from solar access is fine. So and that was a steel building with precast concrete floor plats. It's all this, when Telstra put out the brief for their offices, I don't know, it's been 10 years ago, it was exactly that building, and that building had been designed and built 60 years earlier.
That bill of ICI house.
Yeah, I see. I
Yes,
have.
I went there too, I know.
Yeah. So, how did you find working there?
Oh, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Full light, and also the way that the office was laid out, it's not, it didn't have director offices all along the windows, it was all sort of common space and sort of, yeah, nobody had a desk right up against the windows. Don't forget the Queensland garden at the bottom, that's pretty nice too. But in terms of the office plan, having that side was fantastic. It's really good.
So I quite often use that here with students because we've forgotten more than we know about buildings.
It was also, I think, voted named the first deciduous building in Melbourne. It's the glass.
It's a glass paving.
Yeah.
I have one more question. And it's a little bit of an uninformed question, I guess. This is going back a little bit to the context of, underutilized office space in Melbourne. And the examples that Andrew you really nicely illustrated with option A, which is in this case option B. I'm wondering how the land values and capital gains and the option of an owner, let's say, to keep the building vacant for a while until they decide what they're going to do or sell it, and the role that it plays to making the option be, let's say, a little bit more of a mainstream rather than an applier. And I'm wondering if there is like any international example that we can see. I have one in mind, and this is, for example, like, state government here, they started reducing vacancy taxes, but that's addressing residential in particular, and now they're expanding into vacant land. I'm wondering, like, if those type of policies can, get the market a little bit moving in that space, because I also understand that like peppercorn leases or very low leases might reduce the value of the property as well. So I'm wondering if there is any regulatory or policy that we can learn from other jurisdictions, so we can make option B a little bit more like of a
I don't know whether it necessarily makes the option work, the option B, the regenerative example work, but the taxes in the UK, there's empty property rates, and that's they're really significant. So really high taxes, a lot higher than land tax and council tax here combined. So you have to pay that if your building is empty for longer than 3 months. You have to start paying. It's quite high, as if it was occupied. So that's usually passed on to the occupier rather than the landlord pay. So it does act as a very good incentive to get them to do something about it. Unfortunately, it also gives them, there are various schemes out there that you can do to avoid that tax from to cover occupation in terms of the definition of it being used. So it could be, for example, you could put a box and it could be storage, and that could be an example of how you'd satisfy the regulation. But it does, and you'll see in that example that I gave of the holding costs